Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the life of a man whose wild hair and gentle eyes have become as iconic as his equations. You're walking through the narrow streets of Bern, Switzerland in 1905, passing a nondescript government building where a 26-year-old patent clerk sits at his desk, secretly rewriting the laws of the universe while processing mundane patent applications. The air is thick with possibility, though no one around him senses it yet. Fair warning, you probably won't survive the mental gymnastics required to fully comprehend what this man's mind was capable of, but that's why you're here, to try anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where in the world you're joining from tonight, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing outside the Swiss Patent Office in Bern, where Albert Einstein, far from being the white-haired sage of popular imagination, is a young man with dark, wavy hair and intense eyes. It's 1905, and Einstein is about to detonate 5 intellectual bombs that will forever change our understanding of reality, all while processing patent applications for electromagnetic devices. This year will later be called his Annus Mirabilis, his miracle year, though at this moment you'd never guess it. Einstein isn't a professor. He doesn't have a PhD. He's been rejected for every academic position he's applied for. The scientific establishment has effectively shut him out. Yet in the margins of his workday, Einstein is crafting papers that will eventually turn physics upside down. His first paper explains the photoelectric effect, proving that light behaves not just as a wave, but also as discrete particles called photons. Ironically, this paper, not relativity, will eventually win him the Nobel Prize. His second paper provides conclusive evidence for the existence of atoms, still a controversial concept at the time, by explaining how tiny particles suspended in liquid move around randomly, Brownian motion. You watch as he sketches calculations during lunch breaks, occasionally staring out the window in deep thought. The third and fourth papers introduce special relativity, demolishing the centuries-old Newtonian framework by proving that time and space aren't absolute, but relative to the observer's motion. You might think such revolutionary ideas would require massive laboratories or universities, but Einstein develops them during evening walks with his wife Mileva, and in conversations at the Olympia Academy, a pretentious name for what's basically a book club with his friends. What's rarely mentioned in textbooks is that Einstein wasn't working in isolation. Historians still argue whether his first wife, Mileva Maric, a brilliant mathematician in her own right, contributed substantively to his theories. Some fringe scholars even claim to have found mathematical notations in her handwriting on early drafts of his papers. The most bizarre thing about this miracle year? Einstein's fifth paper derives the equivalence of mass and energy, yes, the famous E/mc2, almost as an afterthought in a 3-page addendum to his other work. You're essentially watching someone casually jot down the mathematical foundation for nuclear energy while sipping coffee. Throughout this revolutionary year, Einstein remains virtually unknown outside a tiny circle of theoretical physicists. His papers are initially ignored by many established scientists. One reviewer dismisses his work as more philosophical than physical. Einstein, unbothered, continues processing patents by day and rewriting physics by night. You notice how he works, not with complex laboratory equipment, but with thought experiments. He imagines riding alongside a beam of light, visualizes elevators in free fall, and contemplates the nature of simultaneity while synchronizing the town's clocks, part of his actual job at the patent office. In his mind, Einstein conducts experiments that would be impossible in the physical world. As 1905 ends, Einstein remains a patent clerk third class, with a modest salary and no academic recognition. Yet he's just laid the foundation for nuclear energy, quantum mechanics, and a completely new understanding of space and time. And he did it all without the internet, without a calculator, and without even having a private office. You travel back a few decades to Ulm, Germany, where on March 14, 1879, a child with an unusually large head is born to Hermann and Pauline Einstein. The midwife is concerned, but Pauline insists the shape of his head will normalize. Spoiler alert, the head shape might have normalized, but the brain inside it never did. Little Albert doesn't speak until he's nearly 4 years old, causing his parents to fear developmental problems. When he finally does speak, he skips the baby talk entirely and breaks his silence with complete sentences, as if he'd been internally composing symphonies of thought all along. At family dinners, his parents and relatives sometimes wonder if he's slow, as he rehearses sentences under his breath before speaking them aloud, a habit he'll maintain throughout his life. His elementary teachers find him strange and unsettling. One famously tells his father, "Your son will never amount to anything." Another kicks him out of class, claiming his mere presence makes it impossible to teach. You watch as young Albert sits alone during recess, methodically building card houses 11 stories high, showing a patience and spatial reasoning that seems almost unnatural in a child. What's particularly bizarre about Einstein's childhood is that, contrary to popular mythology, he wasn't bad at math. That story was fabricated later. In fact, he was doing calculus for fun at 12, an age when most kids are struggling with basic fractions. He did, however, rebel against the militaristic German education system, with its emphasis on memorization and obedience. "When I think of my school days," he would later write, "it's a miracle that the modern methods of education haven't completely strangled the holy curiosity of inquiry." At age 5, Albert experiences a moment that historians still debate the significance of. His father shows him a pocket compass. Young Einstein is transfixed by the invisible force that moves the needle. Something deeply hidden had to be behind things, he later recalls. This childhood fascination with invisible fields will eventually lead him to revolutionize our understanding of gravity. By 12, Albert is teaching himself geometry from a book his uncle gives him, which he calls his sacred little geometry book. You observe him at night reading by candlelight after his parents think he's asleep, completely absorbed in mathematical proofs that would challenge university students. Meanwhile, his parents, practical, middle-class Jews, hope he'll become an engineer, someone who builds real things rather than chasing abstract theories. A lesser-known fact, Einstein's family ran an electrical engineering business that installed some of the first electrical lighting systems in Munich. Young Albert helps with installations, developing both a practical knowledge of electromagnetism and a lifelong tendency to give awful electric shocks to himself and others due to his theoretical rather than practical approach to wiring. At 16, Einstein makes a decision that shocks his family. He renounces his German citizenship to avoid mandatory military service. The idea of taking orders from drill sergeants is unbearable to him. This leaves him stateless for 5 years, a political limbo that will later influence his complicated relationship with nationalism and patriotism. The teenage Einstein applies to the prestigious Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich and fails the entrance exam. Yes, the greatest scientific mind of the modern era failed a college entrance test. He aces the math and physics portions, but bombs the language, botany, and zoology sections. The school director, impressed by his mathematical abilities, suggests he get a high school diploma first and try again. So Einstein enrolls in a Swiss high school, living with a host family who find him charming but odd. The daughter of the family later recalls how he would play Mozart's violin sonatas with tears streaming down his face, showing an emotional depth that contrasted with his logical approach to everything else. While other teenagers are discovering romance and rebellion, Einstein is pondering what it would be like to race alongside a beam of light. You watch him lying on a hill, staring at the sky for hours, his mind traveling at speeds his body never could. At 17, he conducts his first original thought experiment. If you could catch up to a light wave, what would you see? This seemingly innocent question will eventually demolish Newton's universe. Einstein eventually passes the entrance exam on his second attempt and enters the Polytechnic, where he falls madly in love with the only female physics student in his class, Mileva Marić, a brilliant Serbian woman who walks with a limp due to a congenital hip problem. Their romance, fueled by a shared passion for physics, will soon become complicated by unexpected developments neither of them anticipated. What's perhaps most striking about Einstein's youth is that, despite his obvious brilliance, no one, not his parents, teachers, or friends, has any inkling they're in the presence of someone who will become synonymous with genius itself. He's just a dreamy boy with wild hair and a stubborn streak who happens to be asking the kind of questions that will eventually crack the universe open. You find yourself in the cramped apartment in Bern, where Albert and Mileva Einstein live in relative poverty, their relationship a complex fusion of intellectual partnership and domestic turmoil. It's 1903, and the couple has been married for about a year, though their history together stretches back to their student days when they bonded over physics problems and Mozart sonatas. What your high school textbooks never mentioned is that before their marriage, Mileva gave birth to a daughter named Lieserl in 1902, whom neither parent ever saw grow up. You witness the young couple writing coded letters about the child, while Einstein scrambles to find work and Mileva remains with her family in Serbia to deliver the baby in secret. The fate of this first Einstein child remains one of physics's most haunting mysteries. Historians still argue whether Lieserl died of scarlet fever as an infant or was given up for adoption, vanishing from history either way. Mathematics and physics were at the center of our relationship, Mileva later confides to a friend, revealing how their courtship consisted of solving equations together and discussing scientific papers. Yet just a few years into their marriage, you observe Einstein penning a letter to Mileva that includes a list of demands. You will stop talking to me if I request it, and you will leave my bedroom or study immediately without protest if I request it. Not exactly the romantic poetry most wives hope for. The Einstein household operates on a strange economy of brilliance and neglect. While Albert works at the patent office by day and revolutionizes physics by night, Mileva abandons her own scientific ambitions to care for their sons Hans Albert, born 1904, and Eduard, born 1910. You watch her washing dishes with hands that once calculated differential equations, occasionally glancing at her husband's papers spread across the dining table. What makes this dynamic particularly tragic is that evidence suggests Mileva may have contributed to Einstein's early work, especially the mathematical framework of special relativity. Her name appears on early drafts of some papers, and Einstein once wrote to her, "How happy and proud I will be when we two together have brought our work on relative motion to a victorious conclusion." Note the "our work," a phrase that disappears from his vocabulary after 1905. Their son Hans Albert would later recall finding his parents covering sheets of paper with mathematical equations in the evening, working together until late at night. But while Albert's name would become immortal, Mileva's contributions, whatever their extent, would be erased from scientific history. It's like watching the early Beatles, if only John Lennon had been allowed to take credit for the music. The most darkly ironic aspect of their relationship is that while Einstein was formulating a theory that united space and time, he couldn't unify his own marriage. In 1914, he presents Mileva with another cruel document, separation terms that read more like a business contract than a divorce agreement. Among the terms, he would win the Nobel Prize someday, and she would get the money. At least he got that prediction right. You observe Einstein growing increasingly distant from his family, his mind constantly elsewhere. He develops an infuriating habit of becoming so absorbed in physics problems that he ignores his children for days, sometimes stopping mid-conversation to jot equations in a notebook. Hans Albert later described growing up with a father who was physically present, but mentally on another planet. Despite this domestic dysfunction, Einstein's home life directly influences his scientific work in ways science historians are only beginning to appreciate. The precision timing required for his patent office job reviewing electromagnetic synchronization devices feeds directly into his reconceptualization of time itself. Mileva's mathematical rigor helps shape his sometimes sloppy calculations into publishable form. A quirky detail rarely mentioned in biographies. Einstein cannot swim and is terrified of deep water, yet he loves sailing and frequently takes a small boat out on Swiss lakes, often getting into trouble and needing rescue. This strange combination of fearlessness and impracticality characterizes both his scientific approach and his family life. By 1911, you watch as Einstein and Mileva's marriage crumbles under the weight of his growing fame and wandering eye. He begins a relationship with his cousin Elsa while still married, writing her passionate letters that would make most physicists blush. In one particularly tactless move, he confesses his feelings for Elsa in letters that Mileva herself discovers. There's no uncertainty principle applied to his betrayal. It's painfully obvious. When they finally divorce in 1919, Mileva suffers a complete physical breakdown, described by doctors as melancholia, but what we'd now recognize as severe depression. Einstein, meanwhile, marries Elsa just 3 months after the divorce is finalized, exhibiting a remarkable capacity to move on from emotional entanglements, the same detachment that allows him to discard conventional thinking in his scientific work. Perhaps the most telling insight into their failed marriage comes from Einstein himself, who once admitted, "I need my solitude. I'm not a toy that can be picked up when it suits someone." The same singular focus that made him a scientific revolutionary made him a catastrophic husband and father. You stand in the doorway of the Bern apartment as Mileva packs her belongings, her scientific dreams as shattered as her marriage. Meanwhile, across town, Einstein scribbles equations that will change the world, seemingly unburdened by the emotional wreckage he's created. It's as if his empathy, like energy in his famous equation, has been converted to another form, pure intellectual power, leaving nothing for those closest to him. You're floating alongside a young Albert Einstein as he rides an imaginary beam of light through the Swiss countryside. It's a thought experiment that's occupied his mind since adolescence. What would happen if I traveled at the speed of light and looked in a mirror? Would I see my reflection? The seemingly innocent question leads him down a rabbit hole that will eventually shatter our understanding of space and time. The patent clerk has been working on this problem in his spare time for years now, filling notebooks with calculations while his colleagues process mundane applications. You peek over his shoulder as he scribbles equations during lunch breaks, occasionally staring into space with such intensity that coworkers check to see if he's having a medical emergency. He's not. He's just reimagining the universe. Einstein's genius wasn't just in his mathematical ability, though that was formidable, but in his capacity for what he called thought experiments. While other physicists required elaborate laboratories, Einstein's primary equipment was his imagination. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough, he often says, a philosophy that guides his approach to the universe's most complex problems. The story of relativity begins with a crisis in physics. By 1905, scientists have discovered phenomena that Newton's laws can't explain. Electromagnetic waves seem to travel at the same speed regardless of how you measure them, a physical impossibility according to classical mechanics. It's as if you were driving at 60 miles per hour and a car passing you was always measured at exactly 75 miles per hour, whether you were standing still or already moving at highway speed. Physicists are tearing their hair out trying to make sense of it. Other scientists propose elaborate solutions involving ether, an invisible substance supposedly permeating space through which light waves travel. Einstein, with characteristic audacity, proposes something much simpler and more radical. What if the speed of light is constant for all observers, and instead, time and space themselves are relative? A little-known fact: Einstein wasn't working in isolation. Hendrik Lorentz and Henri Poincaré had developed equations similar to Einstein's, but neither took the conceptual leap to recognize that these weren't just mathematical tricks, but reflections of a new physical reality. Einstein's genius was recognizing that the mathematics wasn't just describing the world, it was revealing its true nature. You watch as Einstein develops his special theory of relativity, which establishes that time passes differently for objects moving relative to each other, and that space contracts at speeds approaching light. The implications are mind-bending. Twins would age at different rates if one traveled in a high-speed rocket. Measuring rods would shrink in the direction of motion. Simultaneity itself, whether two events happen at the same time, depends on the observer's frame of reference. The most famous outcome of this theory is the equivalence of mass and energy, expressed in the equation E=mc2. Originally written as mhec2, this equation was almost a footnote in Einstein's 1905 paper. You look over his shoulder as he derives it in 3 short pages, never suspecting that this elegant formula will eventually lead to nuclear energy and atomic weapons. The universe's most destructive force emerges from what is essentially a conversion formula, like calculating how many cups are in a gallon, except this recipe is for turning matter into pure energy. Perhaps the most humorous aspect of Einstein's revolutionary year was his paper's title, On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies. It sounds like a technical manual for electric train operators rather than the intellectual dynamite that would obliterate Newton's cosmos. Scientists have a gift for underselling their greatest discoveries with bland titles. For a decade after publishing Special Relativity, Einstein wrestles with its limitations. The theory works beautifully for objects moving at constant speeds, but what about acceleration and gravity? You follow him through the streets of Berlin, where he's now a professor, watching him stare at construction workers on scaffolding, contemplating what would happen if they fell. This leads to his happiest thought, that a person in free fall wouldn't feel their own weight. This insight launches Einstein on an 8-year odyssey to develop general relativity. The mathematics required is so complex that Einstein, primarily self-taught in advanced math, struggles to formulate his ideas. He enlists the help of mathematician Marcel Grossmann, begging in one letter, "You must help me or else I'll go crazy." Historians still argue about how much of the mathematical framework came from Grossmann rather than Einstein himself. The core of general relativity is disarmingly simple. Gravity isn't a force, but a curvature of space-time caused by mass. Imagine placing a bowling ball on a trampoline. The depression it creates affects the path of any smaller ball rolled nearby. Similarly, massive objects like the Sun bend the fabric of space-time, causing planets to orbit along these curved paths. You're essentially living in a universe where geometry is destiny. When Einstein finally completes general relativity in 1915, it makes a bold prediction. Light from distant stars should bend as it passes the Sun. The only problem? Verifying this requires observing stars during a total solar eclipse, a rare event made even more challenging by World War I raging across Europe. For 4 years, Einstein's greatest theory sits on the shelf, awaiting experimental confirmation. In 1919, British astronomer Arthur Eddington travels to the island of Principe, off the west coast of Africa, to photograph an eclipse. The resulting images show stars appearing slightly displaced from their known positions, exactly as Einstein predicted. When the results are announced at a joint meeting of the Royal Society and Royal Astronomical Society, the president declares it the most important result obtained in connection with the theory of gravitation since Newton's day. The next morning, the Times of London runs the headline, "Revolution in Science, New Theory of the Universe, Newton's Ideas Overthrown." Einstein becomes a global celebrity overnight, though when asked how he would have felt if the eclipse results had contradicted his theory, he replied with characteristic confidence, "Then I would have been sorry for the dear Lord. The theory is correct." You're standing on Broadway in New York City in 1921, surrounded by a crowd so dense you can barely move. They're not waiting for a movie star or a president. They're here for a physicist. When Albert Einstein's car finally arrives, people push forward so eagerly that police have to intervene. Women scream. Men climb lampposts for a better view. One observer notes that Columbus could not have received a greater welcome. Einstein, bewildered, whispers to his wife, "I feel like a specimen in a zoo." The transformation from obscure patent clerk to international celebrity happened with dizzying speed after the 1919 eclipse confirmed general relativity. Suddenly, this rumpled academic with wild hair found himself the subject of dinner conversations from Berlin to Bangkok. Journalists camp outside his home. Strangers send him letters asking for autographs, life advice, and explanations of the universe in simple terms. Some women even send locks of their hair or intimate photographs. For a man who once struggled to find an academic position, the attention is both gratifying and horrifying. What makes Einstein's fame particularly unusual is that almost nobody understands what he actually did. You overhear people at parties confidently explaining that Einstein proved everything is relative. He didn't. Or that EEMC2 means anything can be turned into a bomb, a gross oversimplification. When a reporter asks Einstein himself to explain relativity, he responds with what becomes a famous quip. When you sit with a nice girl for 2 hours, it seems like 5 minutes. When you sit on a hot stove for 5 minutes, it seems like 2 hours. That's relativity. The reporter laughs, but Einstein has cleverly avoided explaining any actual physics. A quirky detail rarely mentioned in biographies, Einstein receives so many telegrams and letters that the post office assigns him his own personal mail carrier. This unfortunate postal worker delivers sacks of correspondence daily, most of which Einstein ignores. His standard response to technical questions becomes a pre-printed postcard stating, "Due to the high volume of mail, Professor Einstein regrets he cannot answer your inquiry personally." Even geniuses need form letters. The public's fascination with Einstein extends beyond his theories to his personal appearance. His disheveled look, unruly hair, baggy clothes, no socks, becomes part of his brand. When his second wife, Elsa, tries to tidy him up for public appearances, he resists, supposedly saying, "If I'm going to be put on display, I might as well be myself." Historians still argue whether Einstein deliberately cultivated this eccentric appearance or simply couldn't be bothered with social norms. Either way, it works. His distinctive silhouette becomes as recognizable as Charlie Chaplin's. Speaking of Chaplin, during Einstein's visit to Hollywood in 1931, the two famous men attend a premiere together. As crowds cheer, Chaplin tells Einstein, "They cheer me because they all understand me, and they cheer you because nobody understands you." Einstein laughs appreciatively, recognizing the absurdity of his situation. Fame brings material benefits. Universities around the world compete to hire him with increasingly generous offers, but it also brings danger. After the rise of Nazism in Germany, Einstein's prominence as both a Jew and a pacifist makes him a target. The Nazi government places a $5,000 bounty on his head, roughly $100,000 in today's money. You watch as he receives death threats in the mail, some with such detailed plans that the FBI assigns agents to protect him. When asked if he's afraid, Einstein shrugs. "I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious and passionately disinterested in being murdered." The most ironic aspect of Einstein's celebrity is how it affects his scientific work. The constant demands for lectures, interviews, and public appearances leave him with less time for research, just as his theories are opening new frontiers in physics. You observe him at Princeton in the 1930s, looking longingly at his blackboard filled with equations, while his secretary reminds him of 7 pending appointments with journalists, dignitaries, and fellow scientists. Fame becomes both a platform and a prison. Einstein develops coping mechanisms for dealing with unwanted attention. He carries a small notepad to jot down ideas whenever inspiration strikes during tedious social events. He takes sailing trips on Long Island Sound, finding that the combination of wind, water, and solitude helps him think. And most effectively, he learns to use his fame strategically, leveraging his public profile to champion causes from pacifism to civil rights to the establishment of a Jewish homeland. A particularly telling incident occurs in 1930 when a Chicago newspaper sponsors a contest asking what is Einstein's theory of relativity, with a $5,000 prize, equivalent to about $85,000 today. Einstein himself is asked to judge the entries. After reviewing the submissions, he declines to select a winner, stating that none of the explanations is clear enough for the average person to understand. The irony isn't lost on him. The world's most famous scientist is famous for work that almost nobody comprehends. Despite his discomfort with fame, Einstein recognizes its utility. When his books become bestsellers, even though most purchasers never make it past the first few pages, he directs the proceeds to various humanitarian causes. When approached to endorse products from soap to cigarettes, yes, cigarettes, he refuses all commercial offers but readily lends his name to fundraising efforts for refugees and education. The burden of celebrity weighs most heavily on Einstein's personal relationships. Friends from his early years complain that he's become inaccessible, surrounded by gatekeepers. Colleagues hesitate to criticize his work, even when they find flaws in his reasoning. His children struggle with having a father who belongs to the world. You watch as Einstein withdraws further into his inner circle, increasingly dependent on his secretary, Helen Dukas, and his assistant, Ernst Gabor Strauss, to shield him from the outside world. In one particularly revealing moment, Einstein is asked how it feels to be the smartest person alive. He responds, "I don't know. You'll have to ask Nikola Tesla." This humility, alongside his trademark wit, becomes another reason the public adores him, even as the constant attention drives him to seek more and more privacy. By the mid-1930s, Einstein has transformed from scientist to sage, expected to pronounce on everything from politics to religion to child rearing. The transformation is complete when people begin attributing quotes to him that he never said. Even today, Einstein's name is attached to everything from inspirational platitudes about imagination to cynical observations about human stupidity. As he supposedly quipped, though probably didn't, two things are infinite: the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not sure about the universe. You're sitting in a packed Berlin lecture hall in 1914, where Einstein, now a renowned physicist, is about to speak not on relativity, but on the impending catastrophe of World War. The audience shifts uncomfortably as he condemns nationalism as the measles of mankind. A murmur runs through the crowd. Such talk borders on treason in militaristic pre-war Germany. You watch as several audience members walk out, while others scribble furious notes, presumably to report this suspicious pacifist to the authorities. Einstein's journey from apolitical scientist to outspoken activist happened gradually, then suddenly, much like his scientific breakthroughs. As a young patent clerk, he had little interest in politics, focusing entirely on physics problems. "I am by heritage a Jew, by citizenship a Swiss, and by makeup a human being, and only a human being, without any special attachment to any state or national entity whatsoever," he once declared. But the horrors of World War I transformed him. While other German intellectuals sign manifestos supporting the Kaiser's war effort, Einstein joins a tiny minority in opposition. His first political act is remarkably simple. He signs his name to an anti-war manifesto. This seemingly small gesture earns him immediate enemies. Colleagues stop speaking to him. Students boycott his classes. The German physics community, previously happy to claim him as their own, now views him with suspicion. You observe as Einstein receives the first of what will become thousands of hate letters over his lifetime. This one suggesting he go back to Israel, ironic since Israel doesn't yet exist, and Einstein has never been there. What's particularly fascinating about Einstein's pacifism is that it isn't absolute. Despite being labeled a radical pacifist, he later admits that violence might be necessary against threats like Nazism. "If I were Belgian, I would not refuse military service under present conditions," he writes during World War I, showing a nuanced understanding that sometimes one must fight to preserve peace. This pragmatic idealism characterizes his political thought. Principles matter, but so do consequences. A little-known fact: Einstein's political awakening coincides with significant changes in his personal life. As he becomes more engaged with world affairs, his first marriage collapses, partly because Mileva doesn't share his growing political passions. You watch as he writes increasingly distant letters to her, filled with physics and politics, but empty of affection. Meanwhile, his correspondence with cousin Elsa, his future second wife, grows more intimate. She, at least, seems interested in his views on both science and society. In 1919, the same year his divorce is finalized and general relativity is confirmed, Einstein makes his first explicitly political statement to the press, declaring, "I believe in humanity, in the ability of human beings to grow into something better than they have been." This optimism that people can evolve morally just as the universe evolves physically becomes the foundation of his political philosophy. As the 1920s progress, Einstein's fame gives him a platform few scientists have ever enjoyed. He uses it to champion causes ranging from disarmament to educational reform to vegetarianism, though he isn't consistently vegetarian himself, famously saying, "I am living without fats, without meat, without fish, but am feeling quite well this way." He speaks at rallies, signs petitions, and writes op-eds. When a journalist asks why a physicist is dabbling in politics, Einstein retorts, "Isn't every human being political, whether they know it or not?" The rise of Nazism in Germany forces Einstein to confront anti-Semitism more directly. Though never religiously observant, he once described his religious views as a deeply emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power. His Jewish identity becomes central to his public persona as Hitler's power grows. You're with him in 1932 as he decides to leave Germany for a visiting position at Princeton, never to return to his homeland. When asked if he'd ever go back to Germany, he quips, "I would like to very much, but not in this body." Einstein's FBI file begins in 1932, years before he becomes a U.S. citizen, and eventually grows to 100 pages. J. Edgar Hoover becomes obsessed with proving the physicist is a Soviet spy, though no evidence ever materializes. You peek over the shoulder of an FBI agent as he dutifully records Einstein's attendance at a fundraiser for Spanish Civil War refugees, adding it to a growing list of suspicious activities that include supporting civil rights and criticizing McCarthy. The most profound political contradiction in Einstein's life involves nuclear weapons. In 1939, fearing that Nazi Germany might develop atomic bombs, he signs a letter to President Roosevelt urging the U.S. to begin its own nuclear research program, effectively helping launch the Manhattan Project. Yet after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he becomes one of the most vocal opponents of nuclear weapons, famously stating, "If I had known they were going to do this, I would have become a shoemaker." Historians still argue about Einstein's role in creating the atomic bomb. Though he signed the letter to Roosevelt, he had no direct involvement in the Manhattan Project, partly because the military considered him a security risk due to his pacifist and socialist leanings. The irony is almost Shakespearean. The world's greatest pacifist helps create its most destructive weapon, then spends his remaining years trying to put the nuclear genie back in the bottle. In post-war America, Einstein's politics make him increasingly controversial. His support for civil rights, criticism of capitalism, and calls for world government earn him powerful enemies. When Einstein appears on Eleanor Roosevelt's television program advocating nuclear disarmament, advertisers threaten to pull their sponsorship. You watch as he receives death threats from anti-communist vigilantes, while right-wing newspapers label him Einstein the Red. The most poignant political moment in Einstein's later years comes in 1952 when Israel's first president, Chaim Weizmann, dies, and Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion offers Einstein the largely ceremonial position. After careful consideration, Einstein declines, writing, "I lack both the natural aptitude and the experience to deal properly with people." It's a striking admission from a man who transformed our understanding of the universe but struggled with basic human interactions. In the final years of his life, as McCarthyism sweeps America, Einstein advises young people called before congressional committees to refuse to testify, even if it means imprisonment. When a teacher writes asking what to tell his students about the loyalty oaths being required of educators, Einstein replies, "The problem with standing up for human freedom is that one spends most of one's time defending scoundrels. For it is against scoundrels that oppressive laws are first aimed, and oppression must be stopped at the beginning if it is to be stopped at all." Einstein's last political act comes in 1955, just days before his death, when he signs what becomes known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, calling for nuclear disarmament and world peace. The document ends with a stark choice that summarizes Einstein's political philosophy. Remember your humanity and forget the rest. If you can do so, the way lies open to a new paradise. If you cannot, there lies before you the risk of universal death. You're standing in the Grand Hall of the Solvay Conference in Brussels in 1927, where the world's greatest physicists have gathered to discuss the implications of the new quantum theory. The atmosphere crackles with intellectual electricity as a debate unfolds between Einstein and Danish physicist Niels Bohr. Einstein has just uttered the phrase that will echo through scientific history: "God does not play dice with the universe." This showdown represents one of the most fascinating paradoxes of Einstein's career. The revolutionary who overthrew Newton's physics now finds himself cast as the conservative, resisting the next revolution in science. Quantum mechanics, the theory of the atomic and subatomic world, suggests that at the smallest scales, nature is inherently probabilistic. Particles don't have definite positions until measured. Reality is fuzzy, not fixed. For Einstein, who spent his life searching for order in the cosmos, this is intellectual heresy. What's particularly ironic about Einstein's resistance to quantum mechanics is that he helped birth the field with his 1905 paper on the photoelectric effect, which showed that light behaves as both a wave and a particle. You watch as a younger generation of physicists, Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, and particularly Niels Bohr, uses Einstein's early work as a springboard to develop ideas that Einstein himself cannot accept. It's like watching a father disown his intellectual children. The Einstein-Bohr debates become the stuff of scientific legend. For years, Einstein devises clever thought experiments designed to expose contradictions in quantum theory, and Bohr patiently finds the flaws in Einstein's reasoning. Their exchanges are models of respectful disagreement, no personal attacks, no appeals to authority, just pure logical argument. You observe Einstein scribbling equations on a napkin during dinner, then triumphantly presenting them to Bohr the next morning, only to have Bohr politely dismantle his objections by afternoon. A quirky detail rarely mentioned in textbooks. During these intense intellectual battles, Einstein and Bohr remained personally fond of each other. They would take long walks together around Brussels, Einstein playing his violin in the evenings, while Bohr listened appreciatively. Their philosophical disagreement never became personal animus, a model of scientific discourse rarely seen in today's fractious academic environment. The heart of Einstein's objection to quantum mechanics was its implication that the universe is fundamentally random rather than deterministic. He couldn't accept that God, or nature, as he often used the terms interchangeably, would create a reality governed by probability rather than certainty. "I cannot believe that God plays dice with the world," he repeats in various forms throughout his later years, to which Bohr famously replies, "Einstein, stop telling God what to do." Historians still argue about the psychological roots of Einstein's resistance. Some suggest it stemmed from his religious sensibilities, not conventional religion, but his profound belief in a rational cosmic order. Others point to his philosophical commitment to realism, the view that objects exist independently of our observation of them. Quantum mechanics, with its observer-dependent reality, violated this core principle. Or perhaps it was simply that Einstein, now in his 50s, had become less intellectually flexible, unable to make the conceptual leap that his younger self would have embraced. The most sophisticated challenge Einstein poses to quantum mechanics comes in a 1935 paper co-authored with Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, now known as the EPR paradox. The paper describes a thought experiment involving entangled particles that seem to influence each other instantaneously across any distance, what Einstein dismissively calls spooky action at a distance. According to Einstein, this apparent faster-than-light influence proves quantum theory must be incomplete. You witness Einstein's growing isolation from the mainstream of physics as the quantum revolution progresses without him. Younger physicists still revere him, but increasingly view his objections as missing the point. In private conversations, some suggest he's simply too old to grasp the new paradigm. At Princeton, graduate students whisper that one should visit Einstein out of respect for history, rather than to learn cutting-edge physics. The ultimate irony is that subsequent experiments would prove Einstein wrong about quantum mechanics, but right about its philosophical implications. In the 1960s, physicist John Bell devised a test of the EPR paradox, and when the experiment was finally conducted in the 1980s, it confirmed quantum theory's predictions. Nature really does seem to allow spooky action at a distance. Yet Einstein's insistence that this reveals a deeper reality beyond quantum mechanics continues to inspire research into quantum foundations today. A fascinating tidbit, Einstein's objections to quantum mechanics weren't just philosophical. He also had aesthetic objections. He found the mathematics ugly, compared to the elegant geometry of general relativity. You overhear him telling a colleague, "The theory yields much, but it hardly brings us closer to the secret of the old one. In any case, I am convinced he does not play dice." This fusion of scientific, philosophical, and aesthetic criteria was typical of Einstein's approach to physics. As the decades pass, Einstein becomes increasingly isolated in his quest for a unified field theory that would reconcile relativity with electromagnetism, notably not with quantum mechanics, which he still considers incomplete. You observe him working alone at Princeton, filling notebooks with equations, while the physics community focuses on nuclear physics, particle accelerators, and quantum field theory, all developments flowing from the quantum revolution he resisted. The Einstein-Bohr debate reaches its philosophical climax when Einstein asks whether quantum mechanics means the moon exists only when someone looks at it. Bohr's answer is subtle. The moon certainly exists when no one observes it, but quantum mechanics applies to microscopic systems, not macroscopic objects like moons. Einstein remains unsatisfied, convinced that any theory that can't give a complete description of reality at all scales must be incomplete. In a final twist that Einstein would have found both vindicating and frustrating, modern theoretical physics has increasingly circled back to his position through developments like string theory, approaches that seek to restore determinism and realism to fundamental physics. Some contemporary physicists believe Einstein was right too soon, anticipating problems with quantum mechanics that wouldn't become apparent for decades. Others maintain that he simply couldn't accept the radical implications of the theory he helped create. The quantum debate reveals a profound truth about Einstein. His greatest strength, the ability to trust his intuition over conventional wisdom, eventually became a limitation. The same intellectual courage that allowed him to overthrow Newton kept him from embracing quantum weirdness. You watch as he works late into the night at Princeton, still searching for the unified theory that would vindicate his vision of a rational, deterministic universe, a universe that increasingly seems to exist only in his imagination. You walk alongside Einstein on a warm evening in Berlin in 1921 as he contemplates an invitation that has just arrived by courier, a request from Chaim Weizmann, president of the World Zionist Organization, to join him on a fundraising tour of the United States. Einstein is hesitant. Despite being born Jewish, he has spent most of his life indifferent to his heritage, once describing himself as neither Jew nor Gentile, but a man and a member of the human family. Yet rising anti-Semitism in Europe and his own increasing fame have forced him to reconsider his relationship with his Jewish identity. What most people don't realize is that the young Einstein was remarkably detached from Judaism. He briefly embraced Catholicism as a child, attending a Catholic school and even crossing himself before meals. Then, rejected all organized religion by age 12. You witness him in his 20s, happily eating pork and dismissing religious practices as primitive superstitions. When asked about his religious beliefs during this period, he typically responded with vague references to Spinoza's God, a philosophical conception of divinity as identical with nature itself, not a personal deity who answers prayers. The transformation begins gradually around 1920, when Einstein witnesses the rise of anti-Semitism in German academia. Physicist Philipp Lenard, once an admirer of Einstein's work, begins attacking relativity as Jewish physics, contrasting it with German physics, based on experimental evidence rather than abstract mathematics. You observe Einstein's bemused expression as he reads Lenard's critiques, which grow increasingly unscientific and nakedly anti-Semitic. "So now I'm a Jew," Einstein remarks to a friend. "I hadn't realized it before." Einstein's embrace of his Jewish identity involves no religious conversion. He remains a secular humanist throughout his life. Rather, it's a gesture of solidarity with a persecuted people. When I was a young man, he later explains, I rebelled against the Jewish tradition into which I was born. But later, I came to understand that it was not the Jewishness I had rejected, but the unquestioning acceptance of any tradition. Historians still argue whether Einstein truly felt a connection to Jewish culture or merely responded to anti-Semitism with a defiant embrace of the identity being attacked, a quirky detail rarely mentioned in biographies. Despite becoming one of Zionism's most famous advocates, Einstein never learns to speak Hebrew beyond a few phrases. At a reception in Jerusalem during his 1923 visit to Palestine, he delivers his prepared remarks in French, apologizing for his linguistic limitations. When a rabbi presents him with a Hebrew Bible, Einstein admits he can barely read it, prompting the rabbi to joke, like many of our most distinguished scholars. The paradox of Einstein's Zionism is that while he advocates passionately for a Jewish homeland, he opposes the creation of a Jewish state in the conventional sense. You observe him in meetings with Zionist leaders arguing for a binational Arab-Jewish state with equal rights for all citizens. I should much rather see reasonable agreement with the Arabs on the basis of living together in peace than the creation of a Jewish state, he writes in a letter that makes many Zionists uncomfortable. His vision of Palestine is as a cultural center for Jewish intellectual and spiritual renewal, not a political entity defined by ethnicity. This nuanced position makes Einstein an awkward ally for the Zionist movement. You witness heated debates where Weizmann and other Zionist leaders try to keep Einstein on message during public appearances, while privately worrying about his calls for Arab-Jewish cooperation. After one particularly frank interview where Einstein criticizes militant Jewish nationalists, Weizmann quips, "Einstein's understanding of Zionism is the same as my understanding of physics. Normal." The most dramatic moment in Einstein's relationship with Zionism comes in 1952, after the establishment of Israel, when Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion offers Einstein the presidency of the new state following Chaim Weizmann's death. You watch as Einstein reads the telegram in his Princeton home, deeply conflicted. After 24 hours of consideration, he declines, writing that he lacks both the natural aptitude and the experience to deal properly with people. In want viper, Miharai. What he doesn't say explicitly is that his vision of a binational state with equal rights for Palestinians has been rejected in favor of a Jewish nation-state. Einstein's Jewish identity becomes most visible in his humanitarian work. As Nazism spreads across Europe in the 1930s, he leverages his fame to help Jewish refugees, signing affidavits for visa applications, raising funds for relief organizations, and personally sponsoring dozens of scholars fleeing persecution. You observe him at his dining table in Princeton, writing letter after letter to university administrators and government officials, pleading for positions for displaced Jewish scientists. What makes Einstein's advocacy particularly powerful is his willingness to use his celebrity as currency. When applying for American visas for refugees, he sometimes simply writes, "I am Einstein. Trust this person." The strategy works surprisingly often. In one memorable case, he secures a position for a mediocre physicist by telling a university president, "You won't be getting another Einstein, but he's a decent scientist and a human being worthy of saving." This blunt honesty combined with moral clarity proves remarkably effective. The final evolution of Einstein's Jewish identity comes after the Holocaust, when he becomes both more connected to the Jewish people and more critical of Israel's policies. You listen as he tells a friend, "The most important aspect of my Jewish identity is my sense of solidarity with those who are persecuted." This leads him to draw parallels between the treatment of Jews in Europe and other oppressed groups, including, controversially, Palestinians displaced during Israel's founding. In one of his last public statements on Jewish affairs, Einstein signs a letter protesting the visit of Menachem Begin to the United States in 1948, condemning Begin's Herut Party, a predecessor to today's Likud, as closely akin to the Nazi and fascist parties. The letter causes an uproar, with many Jewish organizations denouncing Einstein as a traitor to his people. Unfazed, he tells a reporter, "I would have been a criminal if I had known what was going to happen to the Palestinians and had not raised my voice." The complexity of Einstein's Jewish journey reveals how identity is often forced upon us by external circumstances rather than chosen freely. The young patent clerk who considered himself a human being first and foremost became, through historical forces and personal choice, one of the most famous Jews in world history. As he remarked near the end of his life, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, an almost fanatical love of justice, and the desire for personal independence, these are the features of the Jewish tradition which make me thank my lucky stars that I belong to it. You walk across the Princeton University campus on a crisp autumn day in 1933, following a figure in a rumpled sweater and baggy trousers who strolls along deep in thought, occasionally stopping to jot equations in a small notebook. Albert Einstein has been in America for less than a year, having fled Nazi Germany just as Hitler consolidated power. What was intended as a 3-month visiting professorship has become permanent exile. At 54, Einstein is starting over in a country where he doesn't speak the language fluently and where his celebrity often overshadows his science. Einstein's first impressions of America are a mix of appreciation and bewilderment. The Americans are friendly, self-confident, optimistic, and without envy, he writes to a European colleague. Yet he's startled by American efficiency. They work like machines and think about their work even during their free time, and perplexed by American materialism. You observe him in a department store, baffled by the variety of consumer goods, muttering, "Who needs 17 different kinds of breakfast cereal?" The Princeton that welcomes Einstein is not yet the diverse intellectual hub it will later become. It's a sleepy college town where Einstein's European mannerisms and socialist politics make him an exotic curiosity. You watch as locals stare at him walking barefoot in summer or wearing women's fur slippers in winter. When he gets lost on his first day at the Institute for Advanced Study and asks a student for directions to his office, the young man assumes he's a confused maintenance worker. "The famous Dr. Einstein. He wouldn't dress like that," the student says, pointing him toward the janitor's closet. What's rarely mentioned in biographies is that Einstein's transition to America involved significant financial negotiations. The Institute for Advanced Study offers him the then astronomical salary of $15,000 per year, equivalent to about $300,000 today, plus a secretary and no teaching obligations, just pure research. When reporters ask if he's worth such a princely sum, Einstein quips, "I don't know, but I don't think anyone is worth that much." Despite this generosity, Einstein lives modestly in a small house on Mercer Street, investing most of his income in helping refugees escape Europe. The cultural differences between Einstein's European sensibilities and American customs create frequent comedic situations. You witness him at his first American cocktail party, bewildered by small talk and responding to "How are you?" with a detailed account of his digestive problems. When a socialite gushes, "Oh, Dr. Einstein, I just love your theory of relativity," he solemnly replies, "So do I, madam, so do I," and walks away. After several such encounters, his assistant begins briefing him on American social customs, though Einstein remains charmingly oblivious to many of them. Einstein's relationship with the English language remains playful throughout his American years. Although he eventually becomes fluent, he retains a thick German accent and sometimes deliberately misuses idioms for comic effect. When a reporter asks if he believes in immortality, Einstein responds, "I shall live as long as the last person who remembers me." After a particularly bungled lecture in English, he tells the audience, "I have been speaking for an hour in what you call English, but for all I know, it could have been Chinese." The most significant challenge of Einstein's American period is adapting to his new role as a scientific elder statesman rather than an active revolutionary. You observe him at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, where younger physicists treat him with reverence, but increasingly view his quest for a unified field theory as a quixotic pursuit. When quantum theorist Wolfgang Pauli visits in 1935, he mockingly refers to the Institute as Einstein's Palace of Contemplation, suggesting the great man has retreated from the frontiers of physics into philosophical meditation. A fascinating but little-known aspect of Einstein's American life is his relationship with African Americans during the segregation era. When he arrives in Princeton in 1933, he's shocked to discover that the university and town are racially segregated. You witness his growing indignation as he learns that Paul Robeson, the famous black singer and activist who grew up in Princeton, isn't allowed to perform at the university. Einstein begins deliberately violating segregation norms, inviting black friends to his home and walking with them publicly through town, much to the consternation of local whites. This commitment deepens when Einstein befriends contralto Marian Anderson after she's refused accommodation at Princeton's Nassau Inn due to her race. He invites her to stay in his home, beginning a friendship that lasts for years. When Einstein speaks at Lincoln University, a historically black college in Pennsylvania, he declares, "The separation of the races is not a disease of colored people, but a disease of white people. I do not intend to be quiet about it." Historians still argue about whether Einstein's civil rights activism was driven more by his experience of anti-Semitism in Europe or by his humanistic principles. Einstein's politics make him a controversial figure in Cold War America. His democratic socialism, pacifism, and internationalism, all mainstream positions among European intellectuals, appear radical in McCarthy-era United States. You peek over the shoulder of an FBI agent as he reviews Einstein's file, which eventually grows to 1,800 pages. J. Edgar Hoover writes in one memo, "We must be alert to the fact that Einstein is an extreme radical and every effort should be made to include him on the appropriate security index." Outraged, when Einstein learns of his FBI surveillance, he jokes, "I never realized I was so interesting." The most poignant aspect of Einstein's American exile is his longing for the European intellectual culture of his youth. Despite his gratitude for American protection, he never fully acclimates to American pragmatism and optimism. You listen as he tells a fellow refugee, "In Europe, people live to think. In America, people think to live." He maintains correspondence with European colleagues, reads German literature, and plays Mozart sonatas on his violin, cultural touchstones from a world that, for Jews like him, no longer exists. In his later Princeton years, Einstein becomes increasingly eccentric and detached from conventional academic life. He rarely attends departmental functions, sometimes works in his pajamas and takes long walks, during which he appears to be talking to himself, actually working through mathematical problems aloud. Local children begin following him on these walks, fascinated by the wild-haired old man who sometimes stops to explain the cosmos to them in simple terms. One Princeton resident recalls, "We didn't think of him as the world's greatest scientist. He was just the nice old gentleman who gave out candy at Halloween and couldn't remember where he lived." As World War II ends and the full horror of the Holocaust becomes known, Einstein's relationship with his adopted country grows more complex. He's deeply grateful to America for providing refuge, but increasingly critical of American militarism and materialism when he becomes a U.S. citizen in 1940. he expresses both his appreciation for American freedom and his determination to remain a critical voice. The strength of the Constitution lies entirely in the determination of each citizen to defend it, he tells reporters after the naturalization ceremony. Only if every single citizen feels duty-bound to do his share in this defense are the constitutional rights secure. Moreover, by the 1950s, Einstein has become as American as he will ever be. A permanent resident of his Mercer Street home, a fixture on Princeton's campus, and a contributor to American intellectual life. Yet he remains an outsider by choice, maintaining what he calls a healthy distance from full cultural assimilation. As he tells a visiting European colleague in 1954, a year before his death, "In America, I am still Einstein the European. In Europe, I was always Einstein the Jew. My backstory. Science is the one realm where I am simply Einstein." You stand in the corner of the Oval Office on October 11, 1939, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt reads a letter that will change the course of history. The letter, signed by Albert Einstein but largely drafted by Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard, warns that Germany might develop atomic weapons and urges the United States to begin its own nuclear research. Roosevelt looks up from the two-page document and tells an aide, "This requires action." With that simple directive, the Manhattan Project is set in motion. The irony of this moment is almost unbearable. The world's most famous pacifist has just helped initiate the most destructive weapons program in human history. Einstein, who once declared, "I am not only a pacifist, but a militant pacifist," has made a calculation that will haunt him for the rest of his life. You watch as he sits in his Princeton study that evening, telling Szilard, "I have signed a death warrant for thousands." What's not widely known is that Einstein originally refused to sign the letter. You observe his agonized deliberations with fellow refugee scientists in the summer of 1939 as they debate whether to alert the American government about nuclear fission's military potential. The unleashing of atom power has changed everything except our way of thinking, Einstein argues, fearful of where this knowledge might lead. It's only when Szilard convinces him that the Nazis are likely pursuing the same research that Einstein reluctantly agrees to lend his name to the warning. The Einstein-Roosevelt letter represents a pivotal ethical dilemma that scientists still grapple with today. What responsibility do researchers bear for the applications of their discoveries? Though Einstein's famous equation EMC2 provided the theoretical basis for nuclear weapons, he had never imagined his work would be applied this way. As he later lamented, "If only I had known I should have become a watchmaker." Contrary to popular belief, Einstein had virtually no role in the actual development of the atomic bomb, beyond signing this initial letter. His pacifist views and German birth made military officials suspicious, and he was deliberately excluded from the Manhattan Project. You witness his surprise when, in 1945, he learns about the bombing of Hiroshima, like any other American citizen, by hearing it on the radio. According to his assistant Helen Dukas, Einstein received the news with a prolonged, stunned silence, then murmured, "Woe is me." In the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Einstein becomes one of the most vocal critics of nuclear weapons. When a journalist asks for his reaction to the bombings, he responds with what becomes a famous quote, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." The physicist who helped birth the atomic age now dedicates his remaining years to preventing nuclear apocalypse, a quirky detail rarely mentioned in histories of the Manhattan Project. When government officials eventually did consult Einstein about isotope separation methods for uranium enrichment, his theoretical approach proved impractical for industrial-scale production. His proposed method was mathematically elegant, but would have required technologies not yet invented. As one Manhattan Project scientist later remarked, Einstein was brilliant at seeing the big picture, but sometimes missed the engineering details. Einstein's regret over his role in nuclear weapons development manifests in increasingly political activities during the Cold War. You follow him to emergency meetings of the newly formed Emergency Committee of Atomic Scientists, where he argues passionately for international control of nuclear energy. When asked if another world war might be fought with atomic weapons, Einstein delivers his grimmest prediction. "I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." The most poignant expression of Einstein's nuclear regret comes in 1954, shortly before his death, when Japanese physicist Hideki Yukawa visits Princeton. Yukawa had won the Nobel Prize for his work on subatomic particles, but is haunted by the bombing of his homeland. You witness Einstein greeting him with tears in his eyes, saying simply, "I made one great mistake in my life when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made." The two men sit in silence for several minutes before beginning their scientific discussions. Einstein's evolving position on nuclear weapons reveals the complicated relationship between pure science and its applications. In a 1947 interview, he explains, "I do not believe that civilization will be wiped out in a war fought with the atomic bomb. Perhaps 2/3 of the people of the earth might be killed, but enough men capable of thinking and enough books would be left to start again, and civilization could be restored." This cold calculation reflects his pragmatic side, the same practical assessment that led him to sign the Roosevelt letter in the first place. What's particularly fascinating about Einstein's nuclear regrets is how they transformed his views on scientific responsibility. Before the atomic bomb, Einstein believed in the pure pursuit of knowledge, famously stating, "The important thing is not to stop questioning." After Hiroshima, he begins warning students about the moral dimensions of scientific work. Concern for man himself and his fate must always form the chief interest of all technical endeavors, he tells a group of Caltech students in 1946. Never forget this. In the midst of your diagrams and equations, Einstein's post-war activism extends beyond nuclear disarmament to include a range of progressive causes, from civil rights to world government. When the House Un-American Activities Committee investigates several organizations Einstein supports, he publishes an article titled "Why Socialism?" advocating for democratic planning of the economy. This further damages his relationship with the U.S. government, which now views him as not just politically naive, but potentially subversive. The ultimate irony of Einstein's relationship with nuclear weapons emerges in 1952, when the United States tests the first hydrogen bomb, a weapon thousands of times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan. The theoretical basis for this thermonuclear device relies on quantum mechanics, the very theory Einstein had spent decades criticizing as incomplete. You observe him reading reports of the test, realizing that the physics he rejected has created weapons far beyond what his own theories made possible. As the Cold War intensifies, Einstein becomes increasingly pessimistic about humanity's prospects. In one of his final interviews, he tells a reporter, "The splitting of the atom has changed everything except man's way of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled disaster." When asked if there's hope for the future, he pauses before responding, "Yes, if mankind can evolve a new way of thinking, otherwise I'm a desperate optimist." Just days before his death in April 1955, Einstein signs what becomes known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, calling for nuclear disarmament and peaceful resolution of international conflicts. The document's conclusion reflects Einstein's final thoughts on the technology he helped unleash. "Remember your humanity and forget the rest. If you can do so, the way lies open to a new paradise. If you cannot, there lies before you the risk of universal death. You're sitting in a cramped apartment in Zurich in 1902, watching a young Albert Einstein cradle his newborn daughter, Liesl. His face shows a mix of wonder and concern. He hasn't married the baby's mother, Mileva Maric, yet, and his parents vehemently oppose the relationship. This child, whose existence will remain hidden from public knowledge for decades, represents the first of Einstein's complicated family relationships, a pattern that will follow him throughout his life. Einstein's approach to family might best be described as theoretical rather than practical. He understands the concept of family bonds but struggles with their day-to-day implementation. You observe him writing tender letters to Mileva during their courtship, filled with physics problems and declarations of love in nearly equal measure. "I have to have someone to love, otherwise life is miserable," he writes, "and this someone is you." Yet within a few years of marriage, he's complaining to friends that family life feels like a prison. The mystery of what happened to Liesl, Einstein's first child, haunts biographers to this day. Historians still argue whether she died of scarlet fever in infancy or was given up for adoption. What's certain is that Einstein never saw her in person after leaving Serbia before her birth. The couple's correspondence about the child eventually becomes cryptic, then ceases entirely. When Einstein fills out official documents in later years, he never mentions this first daughter, listing only his sons from his marriage to Mileva. These sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, grow up with an increasingly distant father. After Einstein achieves fame following the 1919 eclipse expedition that confirms general relativity, he separates from Mileva and moves to Berlin, leaving her to raise the boys in Zurich. You watch as young Hans Albert and Eduard wait eagerly for infrequent letters from their father, who sometimes forgets their birthdays but includes physics puzzles for them to solve. A quirky detail rarely mentioned in Einstein biographies: he was apparently terrible at remembering his children's ages. In one letter to his sons, he asks Eduard how school is going, though Eduard is only 5 and hasn't started formal education yet. In another, he sends Hans Albert a book far too advanced for his reading level. This absent-mindedness extends to his own life. Einstein once forgot his address and had to call his secretary from a phone booth to ask where he lived. The divorce agreement between Einstein and Mileva contains one of history's most unusual promises. Einstein pledges that if he ever wins the Nobel Prize, he'll give the money to Mileva. This isn't generosity, but pragmatism. It's essentially alimony in advance. When he does win in 1921, the prize money, approximately $32,000, worth about $500,000 today, goes entirely to his ex-wife, who uses it to support herself, and Eduard, who develops schizophrenia and requires expensive institutional care. Einstein's relationship with Hans Albert eventually deteriorates into outright hostility when his son decides to become an engineer. You witness an argument where Einstein dismisses engineering as merely plumbing compared to theoretical physics. Hans Albert defiantly pursues his career anyway, eventually becoming a respected professor of hydraulic engineering at Berkeley. The two reconcile somewhat in later years, though their relationship remains strained. Hans Albert once tellingly remarked, "Probably the only project he ever gave up on was me." The second marriage to his cousin Elsa brings more family complications. When Einstein initially proposes, he's actually keeping his options open between Elsa and her daughter Ilse. Yes, his own step-cousin's niece. Letters discovered in 2006 reveal that Ilse confided to a friend, "Albert himself has suggested the possibility that I could become his wife." Fortunately for family dynamics, he ultimately chooses Elsa, though the relationship seems based more on convenience than passion. You observe them at breakfast in Berlin, Elsa fussing over his appearance and diet, while Einstein absent-mindedly nods, his mind clearly elsewhere. Elsa comes with 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Margot and Ilse, giving Einstein another chance at family life. His relationship with his stepdaughters is warmer than with his biological sons, perhaps because they demand less emotional involvement. When the family moves to America in 1933, both stepdaughters join them. You witness Einstein at Princeton, more relaxed playing with Margot's children than he ever was with his own sons. When asked about this apparent contradiction, he shrugs. It's easier to be a grandfather than a father. A particularly painful chapter in Einstein's family history involves his younger son, Edward, who showed early brilliance but began experiencing symptoms of schizophrenia in his early 20s. You observe Einstein's distress as he receives reports of Edward's deteriorating condition from Mileva in Zurich. "My poor son," he writes in a letter, "the most difficult burden a person can bear in this life has fallen to you." Einstein tries to find the best doctors and treatments, but 1930s psychiatry has little to offer. Eventually, Edward is institutionalized permanently, dying in a Swiss psychiatric facility in 1965, a decade after his father. Some biographers suggest that Einstein feared that his own abnormal brain structure might have contributed to Edward's mental illness. You witness him in quiet moments, looking at photographs of his troubled son and wondering about heredity and brain development, questions his physics couldn't answer. In letters to close friends, Einstein describes Edward's illness as the greatest sorrow of my life. Einstein's extended family faced the full horror of the Holocaust, adding another layer to his family trauma. While he managed to bring his immediate family to America, many cousins and more distant relatives remained in Europe. You watch as he compiles lists of family members needing visa affidavits, working tirelessly to leverage his fame into rescue opportunities. Despite these efforts, several Einstein relatives perish in Nazi concentration camps, a fact that deepens his already profound guilt about his privileged escape. Late in life, Einstein forms a surrogate family of sorts with his secretary Helen Dukas and his executor Otto Nathan, who live with him in Princeton. Dukas in particular becomes a combination of gatekeeper, confidant, and caretaker, fiercely protecting Einstein from unwanted visitors and managing his correspondence. You observe their comfortable domestic routine, Dukas bringing tea at precise intervals, sorting papers, and occasionally reminding Einstein to eat. When asked if he's lonely without blood relatives nearby, Einstein responds, "I have manufactured my own family. It's much less trouble this way." Perhaps the most revealing statement about Einstein's approach to family comes from a letter he wrote to a friend in 1949. It is strange to be known so universally, and yet to be so lonely. Despite having children, grandchildren, and 2 wives over the course of his life, Einstein never quite mastered the art of intimate connection. The same mind that could envision riding a beam of light struggled to understand the emotional needs of those closest to him. In his final years, Einstein reconciles somewhat with Hans Albert, who visits Princeton occasionally with his children. You witness an elderly Einstein delighting his grandchildren with scientific demonstrations and playful magic tricks. When Bernhard, his grandson, asks about his famous equation, Einstein responds not with physics, but with a gentle joke. It means if you're smart, you'll have a lot of energy to play. It's a moment of grandfatherly warmth that reveals what might have been had he found this balance earlier in life. Einstein's last will and testament reflects his complicated family legacy. He leaves his papers and literary rights not to his surviving son, but to Hebrew University in Jerusalem, with Dukas and Nathan as executors. His personal possessions are few and distributed with little sentiment. The man who revolutionized our understanding of time and space leaves behind a family fractured across time and space, sons, grandchildren, and relatives scattered between America, Switzerland, and elsewhere, connected more by his famous name than by lasting bonds. You're standing in Einstein's cluttered office at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study in 1945. The war in Europe has just ended, and while the world celebrates, the 66-year-old physicist sits hunched over pages of complex equations, muttering to himself. His hair is wilder than ever, his clothes rumpled from sleeping at his desk. A younger colleague enters with news of Germany's surrender, but Einstein barely looks up. "That's good," he says distractedly, "but I think I'm close to something here." He's not working on nuclear physics or quantum theory, fields where significant progress is being made, but on his unified field theory, a quest that will consume the last 3 decades of his life. Einstein's pursuit of a unified theory represents one of science's great ironies. The revolutionary who overturned physics in his youth becomes the conservative elder, working in increasing isolation on a problem that younger physicists consider misguided, if not impossible. You watch as he fills notebook after notebook with tensor equations, seeking the mathematical framework that would unite gravity with electromagnetism, bringing all of physics into a single, elegant formulation. What most people don't realize is that Einstein began working on unification almost immediately after completing general relativity in 1915. It wasn't a late career obsession, but a natural extension of his approach to physics. "I want to know how God created this world," he often says. "I'm not interested in this or that phenomenon. I want to know his thoughts. The rest are details." Yeah. By God, Einstein means the underlying order of the universe. He's seeking what modern physicists would call a theory of everything. The theoretical landscape Einstein navigates grows increasingly lonely as physics evolves around him. Quantum mechanics, which Einstein helped birth but never fully accepted, becomes the dominant framework for understanding the subatomic world. You observe younger physicists visiting Princeton, initially excited to meet the great Einstein, only to leave shaking their heads at his apparent fixation on what they consider a dead end. It was like meeting Newton after Maxwell had already developed electromagnetism, one visitor remarks. He's living in the previous century. A particularly telling incident occurs in 1947, when Einstein hosts Werner Heisenberg, one of quantum mechanics' founders. You listen as Heisenberg enthusiastically describes recent advances in quantum field theory, then politely asks about Einstein's work. Einstein shows him pages of complex equations relating to his unified theory. After studying them briefly, Heisenberg gently suggests that any successful unification must include quantum principles. Einstein dismisses this with a wave. The quantum is a very real thing, but this theory is too ugly to be true. The two great physicists part ways, each convinced the other is fundamentally mistaken. Einstein's approach to unification follows a pattern established throughout his career. He seeks mathematical beauty and simplicity, believing that the fundamental laws of nature must be elegant. God is subtle but not malicious, he frequently says, meaning that while nature's secrets may be cleverly hidden, they follow comprehensible patterns. This aesthetic guide served him well with relativity, but becomes a limitation when facing quantum mechanics, which Einstein famously dismissed as spooky and incomplete. The most poignant aspect of Einstein's unified fieldwork is its increasing divergence from mainstream physics. By the late 1940s, the field has moved on to quantum electrodynamics and the beginnings of particle physics, while Einstein remains focused on classical field theories. You witness a Princeton seminar where a young Richard Feynman presents his revolutionary diagrams for calculating particle interactions. When asked his opinion, Einstein acknowledges the technique's usefulness, but adds, "It seems we are approaching a time when matter is entirely reduced to fields, but it will be the task of the future to comprehend why." The room falls awkwardly silent. Einstein is asking questions from an entirely different paradigm. A quirky detail rarely mentioned in accounts of Einstein's unified theory quest. He developed a peculiar working style in his later years. He would sit for hours in a worn armchair, holding a pad of equations on his lap, occasionally speaking aloud to himself in German. His secretary, Helen Dukas, learns to distinguish between his conversational muttering, which might require a response, and his equation muttering, which should never be interrupted. You observe Einstein solving equations with his eyes closed, his fingers tracing invisible symbols in the air, a man literally trying to grasp the universe through mathematical intuition. Einstein's unified field theory goes through multiple iterations, each announced with diminishing public attention. His first major attempt in 1925 makes front-page news worldwide. By his fifth attempt in 1945, scientific journals publish his papers with minimal commentary, and newspapers ignore them entirely. You watch as he holds a press conference for his 1950 paper, only to face a room of confused reporters asking whether his theory has anything to do with the hydrogen bomb. It doesn't, and the resulting articles are buried in back pages under headlines like "Einstein Still Working on Theory." Historians still argue about whether Einstein's unified fieldwork was entirely misguided or simply premature. Some aspects of his approach, particularly his emphasis on geometric representations of forces, resurfaced decades later in string theory and modern attempts at unification. One Princeton physicist who initially dismissed Einstein's later work later admitted he was asking the right questions, but physics needed another 50 years of development before we could even approach answers. Others maintain that Einstein's classical approach was fundamentally incompatible with quantum reality, representing a mathematical dead end, no matter how long pursued. The most illuminating perspective on Einstein's unified theory obsession comes from Einstein himself. In a rare moment of doubt, he confides to a young assistant, "I have locked myself into an ivory tower of mathematics, while physics has marched on without me." Yet the next day, he's back at his desk, convinced that persistence will eventually reveal nature's secrets. You witness this pattern repeatedly, brief acknowledgments of possible failure followed by renewed determination. When asked why he continues despite decades without breakthrough, Einstein simply replies, "What else would I do with my time? Play the violin all day." Einstein's final attempt at unification comes just days before his death, in April 1955. You stand by his hospital bed at Princeton Medical Center as he scribbles equations on a notepad, occasionally pausing to stare out the window. When a nurse tries to take the pad away, insisting he needs rest, Einstein clutches it tightly, saying, "I might see it differently when I wake." He never does. The incomplete calculations remain on his bedside table when he dies, a symbolic endpoint to a 30-year quest. In Einstein's desk after his death, researchers find dozens of notebooks filled with unified field calculations, many containing approaches he never published. One notebook contains a poignant admission: "Perhaps I have earned the right to make mistakes at my age." Another includes a quote from Spinoza that seems to reflect Einstein's philosophical approach to his long, unsuccessful search. "I have striven not to laugh at human actions, not to weep at them, nor to hate them, but to understand them." The ultimate irony of Einstein's unified theory obsession is that modern physics has validated both his instinct and his failure. His conviction that a unified theory exists has been embraced by contemporary physicists who continue searching for what they now call a theory of everything. Yet his specific approach, excluding quantum mechanics and focusing only on gravity and electromagnetism, has proven inadequate. As one physicist put it, Einstein was right to seek unification, but wrong about what needed to be unified. Ponche. The modern search includes not just gravity and electromagnetism, but the strong and weak nuclear forces, interactions unknown in Einstein's prime. You watch as Einstein, in his final years, occasionally recognizes the magnitude of his task. The years of searching in the dark for a truth that one feels but cannot express, he writes in a letter. The intense desire and the alternations of confidence and misgiving until one breaks through to clarity and understanding are known only to those who have experienced them. The same words could describe both his triumphant work on relativity and his unsuccessful quest for unification, twin expressions of a mind that never stopped asking the universe's deepest questions. You're sitting in a nondescript office at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. in 1950, watching as an agent adds another document to what has become one of the agency's largest files on a private citizen. The subject, Albert Einstein. The file will eventually grow to 1,800 pages of reports, letters, newspaper clippings, and transcripts of wiretapped conversations. Director J. Edgar Hoover has scrawled a note on the cover, "We must find something on Einstein." Einstein's surveillance by American intelligence begins almost immediately upon his arrival in the United States in 1933. Initially, the concerns are his German origins and pacifist views. By the 1940s, his alleged communist sympathies become the primary focus. You observe FBI agents trailing the elderly physicist as he walks to Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, photographing his visitors and sifting through his mail. One agent notes with frustration, subject spends most days working on mathematical equations. No suspicious activity observed. What most people don't realize is that Einstein was aware of being watched and occasionally toyed with his surveillance. You witness him at a peace rally in 1948, looking directly at a man taking photographs from a parked car and giving a friendly wave. In letters to friends, he sometimes adds postscripts like, "Greetings to our friends at the FBI who are reading this correspondence." When told that his phone might be tapped, Einstein replies, "I have nothing to say on the phone that I would not say in public. Perhaps it will educate them." The FBI surveillance reveals more about the paranoia of Cold War America than about Einstein himself. Agents compile extensive reports on his political activities, signing petitions against nuclear weapons, supporting civil rights organizations, advocating diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. One particularly bizarre memo suggests that Einstein's unified field theory might be a coded communication to Soviet scientists. You watch an agent struggling to explain this theory to Hoover, who eventually writes nonsense across the report and demands more concrete evidence of subversion. A quirky detail rarely mentioned in accounts of Einstein's FBI file. Agents were particularly concerned about his friendship with Paul Robeson, the African-American singer, actor, and activist. You observe agents photographing Einstein and Robeson walking together on Princeton's campus, their unlikely friendship, the world-famous physicist and the deep-voiced performer, apparently suspicious to authorities. When Einstein invites Robeson to his home for dinner, after Robeson was denied service at a local restaurant due to segregation, 3 different FBI informants file reports on the event. The surveillance intensifies after Einstein publishes an article titled "Why Socialism" in the Monthly Review in 1949. You peek over the shoulder of an agent who underlines passages where Einstein criticizes capitalism's economic anarchy and advocates for a planned economy with protections for individual rights. The agent's note reads, "Subject reveals clear Marxist leanings while attempting to disguise revolutionary intent." Einstein's actual text is more nuanced, calling for democratic socialism that would preserve personal freedoms, a distinction lost on his FBI readers. Historians still argue about whether Einstein was truly a security risk or simply a convenient target for anti-communist crusaders. His most suspicious act, the 1939 letter to Roosevelt about nuclear fission, was actually an expression of anti-Nazi sentiment rather than disloyalty to America. You watch as FBI analysts pore over Einstein's correspondence, scientific papers, and public statements, searching for evidence that never materializes. One exasperated agent writes in a memo, "Subject expresses unorthodox views, but appears genuinely committed to American democratic principles." The most absurd aspects of Einstein's surveillance involve the misunderstandings of his scientific work. In one report, an agent describes relativity as a theory that there are no absolutes in the universe, suggesting this reflects moral relativism and therefore un-American values. Another report claims that Einstein's criticism of quantum mechanics, his famous "God does not play dice" quote, indicates religious fanaticism that may be exploited by foreign powers. You observe senior FBI officials nodding solemnly at these assessments, completely misinterpreting both the science and the man. Einstein's reaction to McCarthy-era paranoia is both principled and practical. When a teacher writes asking what to do about loyalty oaths being required of educators, Einstein responds with what becomes a famous statement. The problem with standing up for human freedom is that one spends most of one's time defending scoundrels, for it is against scoundrels that oppressive laws are first aimed, and oppression must be stopped at the beginning if it is to be stopped at all. Yet, when called before the House Un-American Activities Committee himself, Einstein prepares a strategic response, telling his lawyer, "I shall not answer any questions. I have done nothing wrong. If they want to put me in jail, they can do so." What's particularly ironic about Einstein's FBI surveillance is that while agents meticulously document his attendance at peace rallies and civil rights fundraisers, they miss his genuine connection to nuclear weapons development, the 1939 letter to Roosevelt that helped initiate the Manhattan Project. You watch an agent laboriously transcribing Einstein's speech at a 1950 disarmament conference, unaware that the elderly pacifist had played a small but critical role in creating the very weapons he now protests. The surveillance extends beyond Einstein himself to his associates, creating what one Princeton colleague calls a miasma of suspicion around the physicist. Einstein's secretary, Helen Dukas, notices cars following her on shopping trips. His assistant, Ernst Gabor Strauss, is questioned repeatedly about his boss's political activities. You observe Einstein comforting a young physicist who loses a government research position after being seen entering Einstein's home, telling him, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act." The final assessment in Einstein's FBI file, written shortly before his death in 1955, reveals the ultimate futility of the surveillance. After 22 years of investigation involving dozens of agents and informants, the conclusion reads, "Subject has associated with various organizations considered communist fronts, but appears motivated by humanitarian rather than revolutionary impulses. No evidence of espionage or treasonable activity discovered." Foy, you watch as this report is filed away, the culmination of an enormous expenditure of resources that found nothing more sinister than an elderly scientist with progressive political views. The postscript to Einstein's FBI surveillance comes decades later when his file is released under the Freedom of Information Act. Historians discover that substantial portions remain classified, with numerous pages redacted or missing entirely. This fuels speculation about what the government might still be hiding, though most scholars suspect the redactions reflect FBI embarrassment rather than actual revelations. As Einstein himself once observed, "The secret to creativity is knowing how to hide your sources." Apparently, the FBI took this advice literally with his file. In one of his last interviews before his death, Einstein is asked if he worries about government surveillance. He responds with characteristic perspective, "I have lived through the greatest evil that mankind can inflict on itself, systematic hatred and destruction of a people. So why should I worry about a few government officials reading my mail? After a pause, he adds with a twinkle, "Besides, my handwriting is so poor that it serves as its own encryption." It's a reminder that the man under surveillance maintained both his principles and his sense of humor in the face of suspicion that would have broken lesser spirits. You're standing in the hallway outside Einstein's bedroom at Princeton Hospital on April 13, 1955. A nurse emerges, shaking her head. "He still refuses surgery," she tells the concerned doctor. Inside, the 76-year-old physicist lies propped against pillows, gazing calmly out the window at spring blossoms. When the doctor returns to make one more plea about operating on his ruptured aortic aneurysm, Einstein responds with what will become his final famous quote, "I want to go when I want. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." Einstein's approach to his own mortality reveals the same independence and clarity that characterized his scientific work. You observe him in his final days, refusing extraordinary medical interventions with the same certainty he once used to reject quantum indeterminacy. To his physician, Dr. Dean, who argues that new surgical techniques might extend his life by years, Einstein replies, "Let it be, let it go." When a hospital chaplain offers spiritual counsel, Einstein politely declines, saying, "The word God is for me nothing but the expression and product of human weaknesses." The Bible is a collection of venerable, but still rather primitive legends. What's not widely known about Einstein's final years is that he had been preparing for death for some time. His house on Mercer Street in Princeton contains carefully organized files with instructions for his executor, Otto Nathan, and Secretary Helen Dukas about the disposition of his papers. You watch as Einstein, in the months before his final hospitalization, systematically reviews his correspondence, occasionally chuckling at letters from decades past, or pausing thoughtfully over old photographs. "I'm putting my affairs in order," he tells a concerned friend, "not out of morbidity, but out of courtesy to those who will have to deal with all this when I'm gone." The most poignant aspect of Einstein's later years is his awareness of his declining creative powers. The psychic entities which seem to serve as elements in thought are certain signs and more or less clear images which can be voluntarily reproduced and combined, he writes in an autobiographical note. This combinatory play seems to be the essential feature in productive thought before there is any connection with logical construction in words or other kinds of signs which can be communicated to others. By his 70s, Einstein finds this combinatory play happening less frequently, a source of both sadness and acceptance. A particularly touching detail about Einstein's final decade, despite his fame and the constant demands on his time, he dedicates part of each day to answering letters from children. You observe him at his desk, carefully responding to a 10-year-old girl who asks whether scientists pray. Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, he writes. To another child who asks if he believes in ghosts, he responds, "I am not much of an expert on ghosts, having never seen one myself, though I have friends who claim they have. Before forming a firm opinion, I would need to witness such an apparition personally, just as I would need to observe any scientific phenomenon." Einstein's final project, beyond his continuing work on unified field theory, is a speech prepared for Israel's 7th anniversary celebration. Though too ill to deliver it, he works on drafts from his hospital bed. You watch as he struggles to find the right words to express his hopes for peace between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. The attitude we adopt toward the Arab minority will provide the real test of our moral standards as a people, he writes in one version. The undelivered speech is found on his desk after his death. a last testament to his belief that scientific and moral progress must advance together. The physical decline of Einstein's final years is accompanied by an increasing philosophical depth. He reads more poetry, particularly Goethe, and often discusses questions of meaning with visitors. When a young physicist complains about the absurdity of existence, Einstein responds, "The man who regards his own life and that of his fellow creatures as meaningless is not merely unfortunate, but almost disqualified for life." This existential certainty that meaning exists even if it can't be mathematically proven provides Einstein comfort as his body fails. A quirky detail rarely mentioned in accounts of Einstein's final years. He becomes increasingly fond of ice cream, particularly vanilla with chocolate sauce. You witness him sneaking this forbidden treat despite his doctor's orders about his strict diet for diabetes and heart problems. When his housekeeper finds empty ice cream containers hidden behind books on his shelf, Einstein shrugs and says, "I have few pleasures left. Please don't deprive me of this one." His doctor eventually relents, joking, "Who am I to argue with relativity?" Einstein's deteriorating health in his final years coincides with the peak of the Cold War and the hydrogen bomb tests. You observe him watching newspaper headlines with increasing distress, telling a visitor, "The splitting of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and thus we drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." When asked if he believes humanity will survive the nuclear age, Einstein gives his measured assessment, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." This apocalyptic vision makes his own approaching death seem almost trivial by comparison. Historians still debate whether Einstein suffered from depression in his final years. His correspondence shows both deep concern about world affairs and continued intellectual curiosity. You watch as he alternates between periods of withdrawal and engagement, sometimes refusing visitors for days, then suddenly hosting animated discussions about physics or politics. When a friend asks about his mood swings, Einstein responds, "I have never belonged wholeheartedly to any country or state, to my circle of friends, or even to my own family. I have never lost a sense of distance and a need for solitude." This lifelong detachment serves him well as he prepares for the ultimate separation. On his final conscious day, April 17, 1955, Einstein experiences a moment of unexpected clarity. You stand quietly in the corner as he suddenly begins speaking in rapid German to his stepson-in-law, Rudolf Kaiser, outlining a new approach to his unified field equations. Kaiser, who understands little about advanced physics, frantically takes notes, recognizing this as perhaps the last flash of genius from the great mind. When Einstein finishes, he looks puzzled, as if waking from a dream, then smiles and says in English, "I was so close that time, maybe next time around." That night, Einstein speaks his final words in German to a nurse who doesn't understand the language. They are lost forever, though rumors persist that his last statement was a solution to the unified field theory. More likely, given Einstein's clear-eyed approach to death, they were something simple and human, perhaps gratitude to the caretakers who made his final days comfortable. Einstein dies at 1:15 a.m. on April 18, 1955. Following his explicit instructions, there is no funeral service, no grave marker. His body is cremated the same day, but not before pathologist Thomas Harvey removes his brain without family permission, beginning one of the strangest postscripts to any scientific life. You watch in the hospital morgue as Harvey carefully preserves the organ that revolutionized our understanding of the universe, convinced it must contain anatomical clues to genius, ignoring Einstein's wish for complete cremation. In Princeton, news of Einstein's death spreads quickly. Students and faculty gather spontaneously on the lawn outside the Institute for Advanced Study. standing in silent tribute as rain falls gently. One observer notes that Einstein would have appreciated the symmetry. His life began during a rainstorm in Ulm, Germany, and ends during a spring shower in Princeton. A colleague recalls Einstein's own words about death. Our death is not an end if we have lived on in our children and the younger generation, for they are us. Our bodies are only wilted leaves on the tree of life. As Einstein had wished, his ashes are scattered at an undisclosed location. No monument marks his final resting place. Instead, his equations live on in physics textbooks, his image in popular culture, and his ethical principles in the ongoing work of scientists who believe, as he did, that the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. You're standing in a dimly lit laboratory at Princeton University on April 18, 1955, watching pathologist Thomas Harvey as he carefully removes Einstein's brain from his skull. Harvey has no authorization for this procedure. Einstein's son, Hans Albert, will reluctantly give retroactive permission only after Harvey promises the brain will be used for scientific study. Little does anyone suspect that this organ will embark on one of the strangest journeys in scientific history, traveling across America in everything from a jar in the trunk of Harvey's car to a cider box under a beer cooler. The secrets Einstein took to his grave extend far beyond his missing brain. Throughout his life, the physicist maintained what he called his Jerusalem Archive, a collection of personal papers and notes he deemed too sensitive for contemporary publication. You peek over the shoulder of his longtime secretary, Helen Dukas, as she sorts through these documents in the days following his death, setting aside certain letters and notebooks according to Einstein's instructions that they remain sealed for decades after his death. What did these restricted papers contain? Some were finally released in 2018, revealing Einstein's complex and often troubled inner life. You scan letters to his second wife, Elsa, where he openly discusses his affairs with other women, suggesting a surprisingly open marriage. Other documents contain brutally honest assessments of fellow scientists, calling one Nobel Prize winner a second-rate mind and dismissing another's work as mathematically elegant but physically irrelevant. Perhaps most surprising are entries from a personal journal where Einstein questions whether his opposition to quantum mechanics stemmed more from psychological resistance to randomness than from scientific objection. The most tantalizing Einstein secret involves a mathematical formula that appears in several of his late notebooks, labeled simply Cake Chai. Historians still argue about its significance. Some believe it represents Einstein's final approach to unified field theory, while others suggest it was his attempt to model consciousness mathematically. You notice the equation contains elements resembling both field equations and what modern physicists would recognize as information theory, decades ahead of its time. When an assistant asked about this formula shortly before Einstein's death, he reportedly smiled and said, "That? Just a little side project. Probably nothing." A quirky detail rarely mentioned in Einstein biographies. He left behind dozens of pipes, but no tobacco. In his final years, Einstein had taken to carrying an unlit pipe merely as a thinking prop, chewing on the stem while contemplating physics problems. You observe Otto Nathan, Einstein's executor, finding these pipes carefully arranged on his desk, each labeled with a small tag indicating which unified field approach he was considering while using that particular pipe. The one labeled asymmetric field appears the most chewed, suggesting it occupied his final thoughts most intensely. The disposition of Einstein's papers created unexpected drama after his death. Though he left clear instructions that his scientific papers should go to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, controversy erupted over his personal correspondence. You witness heated discussions between Helen Dukas, who fiercely protected Einstein's privacy, and historians who argued that his personal life was inseparable from his scientific contributions. Some letters remained sealed until 2017, over 60 years after his death, revealing Einstein's complicated romantic entanglements and sometimes scathing opinions of fellow scientists. Perhaps the most profound Einstein secret revealed after his death was the extent of his humanitarian work. His estate contained hundreds of canceled checks to individuals, mostly Jewish refugees and their families, whom he had supported financially without publicity. You watch as Nathan discovers a ledger showing that Einstein, despite his modest lifestyle, had donated over 90% of his substantial income from books, lectures, and the Nobel Prize to various causes and individuals in need. When asked once why he didn't publicize these contributions, Einstein replied, "Giving publicly is not giving, it's trading. You give publicity and get virtue in return." The quest to understand Einstein's brain represents one of science's strangest episodes. After removing it during the autopsy, Thomas Harvey didn't just send it to qualified neuroanatomists as promised. Instead, he kept it for himself, eventually losing his medical license and job at Princeton Hospital. You follow Harvey as he moves to Wichita, Kansas, taking Einstein's brain with him, stored in a jar in his office. Over decades, he sends occasional slices to various researchers while working as a medical supervisor in a plastics factory, a spectacular downfall for a once respected pathologist. Only in the 1980s did serious studies of Einstein's brain begin appearing in scientific literature. The findings were intriguing but inconclusive. You review papers showing that Einstein's parietal lobes, regions associated with spatial reasoning, mathematical thought, and imagery, had unusual features, including a missing groove called the Sylvian fissure, allowing for potentially greater connectivity. His brain also contained more glial cells, the support cells that nourish neurons, than average brains, particularly in areas involved in complex thinking. Whether these differences explained his genius or resulted from a lifetime of theoretical thinking remains debated. The most bizarre chapter in the brain saga occurs in 1978, when journalist Stephen Levy tracks down Harvey and convinces him to show him Einstein's brain. You witness their surreal road trip across America, with the brain stored in a Tupperware container in the trunk of Harvey's Buick Skylark. At one point, they stop at a cider mill in Kansas, and Harvey temporarily stores pieces of the brain in a cider box under a beer cooler while they have lunch. Levy later recalls thinking, "Here I am on a road trip with a piece of Einstein in the trunk, and we just stopped for apple cider." Einstein's most lasting secret may be the true extent of his influence on modern life. Beyond the obvious applications of relativity and GPS satellites and nuclear energy, his work laid foundations for technologies he never imagined. You review patents for lasers, solar panels, and modern electronics that all cite Einstein's photoelectric effect paper as their theoretical basis. His equations describing Brownian motion became essential to fields from weather prediction to financial modeling. Even Einstein's famous biggest blunder, the cosmological constant he added to his equations and later removed, has been resurrected by modern cosmologists to explain dark energy and the universe's accelerating expansion. In his final years, Einstein worked on what he called a theory of everything, but admitted to friends he might not live to complete it. Modern physicists pursuing string theory and other unification approaches consider themselves Einstein's intellectual heirs, still seeking the elegant unification he believed must exist. You observe a contemporary physics conference where speakers still quote Einstein's methodological principles. Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. Perhaps Einstein's greatest unspoken secret was his profound humility about his own achievements. In a letter sealed until 2016, he confessed, The exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler. This imposter syndrome from one of history's greatest minds reveals the gap between public perception and private self-assessment that characterized his entire life. As you walk through the small house on Mercer Street where Einstein spent his final years, you notice something strange about his bookshelves. Mixed among physics texts and philosophy volumes are dozens of science fiction novels, a genre Einstein never publicly discussed but privately devoured. His collection includes signed first editions from H.G. Wells and Jules Verne, along with more obscure works. When asked once by a student if he read fiction, Einstein reportedly replied, "How else would I know what questions to ask next? Sometimes the poets see farther than the physicists." The final Einstein secret may be that there is no final secret, just a brilliant, complex, contradictory human being whose mind happened to unlock some of the universe's most profound mysteries. As Einstein himself wrote in notes found after his death, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead. His eyes are closed." You stand now in the present day, watching as a physicist writes Einstein's most famous equation, E=mc2, on a classroom blackboard. The teacher tells students how this simple formula changed the world, unleashing the power of the atom and redefining our understanding of energy and matter. What the teacher doesn't mention is the man behind the equation, his dreams and doubts, his flaws and virtues, his struggles and triumphs. For all his universe-altering discoveries, perhaps Einstein's most remarkable achievement was remaining recognizably imperfectly human while glimpsing the mind of God. As you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine Einstein looking up at the stars, pipe in hand, contemplating the vast cosmos with the same wonder we feel when considering his extraordinary life. The universe, like the man who revealed so many of its secrets, remains an elegant mystery, comprehensible in parts but never fully known, continuously unfolding in ways that would have delighted even Einstein himself. The universe has a rhythm to it, like the gentle rise and fall of your breath as you relax more deeply now. Einstein understood this harmony, this cosmic dance of particles and waves, space and time. As your mind grows quieter, imagine the elderly Einstein sitting by a window in Princeton, watching raindrops trace relativistic paths down the glass, finding peace in the order beneath chaos. Your breathing slows, matching the unhurried pace of Einstein's later years. The weight of discovery and fame had taught him that rest, too, is part of the scientific process. Your body feels heavier now, settling comfortably as Einstein's equations settle into the fabric of modern physics, permanent, reliable, at ease. The questions that kept Einstein awake about time, space, and the unified nature of reality can wait until morning. For now, allow your thoughts to drift like light particles through the double slit of consciousness, sometimes waves, sometimes particles, but always moving toward deeper rest. Einstein once said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. But perhaps the most wonderful thing about sleep is that it requires no comprehension at all, just surrender, just trust, just the gentle release of conscious thought into the quantum foam of dreams. As your awareness dims like a light beam stretching across expanding space, remember that even the greatest mind of the modern age needed rest. Einstein's brain, now studied in laboratories around the world, once needed the simple renewal of sleep, just as yours does now. Let go, drift away, and join Einstein in that universal state where all minds, brilliant and ordinary alike, find their common humanity in peaceful slumber.